Okay, let's take a deep breath. Today, we are strapping in for quite a deep dive.
We really are.
We're tackling one of the most, I guess, powerful, but also pretty challenging moral theories out there, utilitarianism.
Mm-hmm. And our mission really is to get under the hood, to understand how its founders, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, tried to make morality almost scientific, based on happiness.
Yeah, like a verifiable equation.
Yeah.
The key phrase, the one thing you really need to grab onto right away is this. Utilitarianism is all about the greatest happiness of the greatest number.
Right. Though that basic idea, it's not entirely new. It has links to ancient hedonism, the Epicurean.
Oh, yeah, the whole eat, drink, have sex, and be merry for tomorrow you will die kind of vibe.
Exactly that. Just immediate pleasure seeking. And you see versions of that across different cultures.
Like, didn't the historian Gonzalo describe ancient Visayan Filipinos as pretty hedonistic?
Yeah.
Sort of merry-go-lucky approach, focusing on immediate satisfaction?
He did, yeah. That's one cultural example. But the modern shift, that's the real game changer here. Bentham and Mill weren't just after a merry-go-lucky philosophy.
No, they wanted something rigorous.
They wanted a science of morality. Modern utilitarianism really grew out of experimental science, and it consciously tried to ditch purely speculative ideas of right and wrong.
Exactly. They were searching for a moral method you could actually, quantify. Something verifiable, focused on real-world consequences.
Things like social reform, community betterment. Stuff you could see and measure, not just abstract virtues or divine commands. They wanted results you could count.
Okay, so let's dig into that scientific approach. Starting with the man who basically invented the moral spreadsheet, Jeremy Bentham, born 1748.
Right. And Bentham wasn't just theorizing in an ivory tower. He was interested in the practical side, finding a moral standard to judge actual laws, political institutions.
And he kicked things off with this really fundamental assertion about what drives us.
He did. His famous line, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure." That's it. That's what dictates everything we do, according to him.
So, simple enough. But how did he define pleasure?
Well, pretty broadly, actually. Any feeling of well-being. Could be from eating, drinking, sure, but also reading a book, listening to music, anything that feels good.
And utility, that's the other key term.
Utility is just the property in something, an object, an action that tends to produce that pleasure or good or happiness for whoever's interest you're considering. It's the usefulness for generating pleasure.
Okay, makes sense. But here's where it gets, well, really fascinating and maybe a bit daunting.
The Felicific Calculus.
Yes. His principle isn't just a statement. It's like an instruction manual, a method for weighing pros and cons.
Precisely. He called it the Felicific Calculus. The idea is that the morally right action is the one that, when you run the numbers, produces the absolute maximum pleasure and minimum pain for everyone affected.
I mean, the sheer audacity of trying to quantify a moral choice like that, it's incredible. But the calculus itself, it's got layers, 7 elements you have to measure.
7, yes. These are supposed to be the objective yardsticks you apply to any potential action, or even looking back at a past action.
Wait, hang on. Let's make this concrete. So, say you are trying to decide between 2 jobs. One's high stress, pays great, but you're never home. The other is lower stress, less pay, but way more family time. Bentham says I have to run the calculus on this.
In his world, absolutely. You'd have to measure, okay, first, intensity. How strong is the pleasure from each option? Second, duration. How long will that pleasure last?
Okay, intensity, duration. Those seem straightforward enough.
Third, probability. How certain are you that this pleasure will actually happen? And fourth, proximity or propinquity. How soon will you get the pleasure? Is it immediate or far off?
Right. Intensity, duration, probability, proximity. Got those 4. But the next 3, this is where it starts to feel a bit more academic maybe. Fecundity and purity. What exactly are those measuring?
That's a great point, because they're crucial for the long game. Fecundity is about how fertile the pleasure is. Does doing this thing lead to more pleasures later on?
Ah, like a ripple effect.
Exactly. Think about starting a good exercise routine. The initial pleasure might be moderate, but it's highly fecund because it leads to feeling healthier, sleeping better, having more energy, all subsequent pleasures.
So it's not just the immediate hit, but it's power to generate more good stuff later.
Yeah.
Okay, and purity. Is that the opposite?
Pretty much. Purity measures the downside. Does the pleasure come packaged with painful side effects? Think about, say, drinking a lot of alcohol.
Right. High intensity maybe, decent duration.
But if you have a terrible hangover the next day, That pain reduces the purity of the pleasure you had. You have to subtract that pain from the total score.
That's actually quite clever. He's accounting for the whole picture, immediate and delayed, good and bad. Okay, and the seventh, the final element, extent. This must be where the greatest number part comes in.
Absolutely crucial. Extent test asks, how many people are affected by this action? You can't just calculate your own pleasure. You have to factor in the pleasure or pain caused to everyone involved, the whole community.
Which leads directly to that rule about equality, right?
Right.
Everybody is to count for one, nobody for more than one. That must have been pretty radical back then.
Hugely radical, especially in an age of strict social hierarchies. And Bentham knew people might try to cheat the system, maximize their own pleasure, even if it hurt others.
So he built in deterrence.
Exactly. 4 kinds of sanctions, he called them. Basically, external checks to keep our natural selfishness in line.
Okay, what are they?
You've got political sanctions of the law, getting arrested, fined, that sort of thing. Religious sanctions, the idea of punishment in the afterlife. Physical sanctions, the direct, natural consequences on yourself, like getting sick if you eat bad food.
Yeah.
And importantly, social sanctions.
Let's pause on that social one. So if I do something that makes me happy but upsets my whole neighborhood, the social sanction is like people gossiping about me, maybe shunning me.
Precisely. Public opinion, disapproval, gossip.
And Bentham saying the fear of that gossip, the potential pain of that social disapproval, is something I actually factor into my calculation before I act.
Yes. The whole system runs on anticipated consequences. The potential pain of social shame is a real negative value you have to subtract from your expected pleasure. That fear, along with the other sanctions, is meant to nudge you towards actions that benefit the community.
Wow. Okay, so for Bentham, ethics isn't some mystery. It's just the method for figuring out how to get the most pleasure and happiness properly and effectively. That's our fundamental goal.
That's the core of his system, a quantifiable path to happiness.
So Bentham builds this incredibly detailed, almost mathematical system. And then along comes John Stuart Mill.
Born 1806. And Mill looks at Bentham's picture of humanity and thinks, it's a bit thin.
But narrow.
Yeah, too focused on basic sensations, almost animalistic pleasure and pain avoidance. Mill argued that our ultimate end isn't just pleasure or avoiding pain in that simple sense.
He aimed higher.
Much higher. He talked about a more generalized kind of happiness, something you seek as an end in itself. Things like spiritual perfection, gaining knowledge, appreciating beauty, creative pursuits.
Things that aren't just about feeling good in the moment. And this leads to his massive shift, right? The idea that not all pleasures are created equal.
Exactly. Mill introduces the idea of qualitatively different kinds of pleasure. There are higher pleasures and lower pleasures.
And this is where that iconic quote comes in.
The unforgettable one. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied.
Which sounds profound, but philosophically, that throws a huge wrench in the works, doesn't it?
It really does, because if being Socrates, even unhappy Socrates, is inherently better than being a perfectly contented fool,
then the quality of Socrates' intellectual life, even with its dissatisfaction, outweighs the sheer quantity of simple pleasure the fool enjoys.
Precisely. Mill is suggesting the highest form of happiness is about the harmonious development of the whole person, our higher faculties.
But hang on. If the pleasure of, say, understanding philosophy is qualitatively better than the pleasure of eating a huge cake, how do you measure that?
And that's the conflict. That's the critical caveat.
You can't just count hours of happiness or units of pleasure anymore. Introducing quality seems to blow up the whole objective empirical measurement system Bentham built.
It seriously complicates it. You could say Mill created a kind of hybrid. He wanted to keep the utilitarian goal greatest happiness, but he raised the standard for what counts as happiness, moving it closer to ideas from virtue ethics or intellectual traditions.
Okay, so we have Bentham, the meticulous accountant of pleasure units, and Mill, the connoisseur of finer happiness. How do we reconcile these? Or even just understand where they fit?
Well, this is where another thinker, Henry Sidgwick, becomes really useful. He came a bit later, 1838-1900.
And he classified different types of hedonism, right? Helping us sort this out.
Exactly. Sidgwick laid out 3 main categories for how people approach happiness or pleasure as the ultimate good.
What are they?
First, there's egoistical or psychological hedonism. Pretty straightforward. The good is simply defined as the greatest happiness for the person acting. It's all about me.
Okay, self-focused. What's second?
Second is intuitionism. This view holds that there are ultimate goals or goods that go beyond just simple utility or pleasure. Things like knowledge, virtue, beauty.
Mm.
They're seen as good in themselves, intuitively, regardless of how much pleasure they produce or for how many people.
So intrinsic value, not just calculated value. And the third.
Third is universal hedonism. This is basically utilitarianism as we generally understand it. The goal is the greatest happiness for everyone affected by the action, the greatest good for the greatest number.
Right. Egoistical, intuitionist, universal. Now, applying that framework back to Bentham and Mill, this is where the source material gave me a real aha moment.
It's quite revealing, isn't it?
Despite inventing the calculus that demands we consider everyone's happiness via the extent element, Sidgwick classifies Bentham as a psychological hedonist.
Which sounds contradictory at first. Why? If he's counting everyone, how is he purely egoistical?
Because, according to this interpretation, Bentham's ultimate reason for caring about others' happiness is still self-serving.
Exactly. He encourages considering others' happiness, yes, but only because failing to do so will likely bring pain back onto himself through those sanctions, social disapproval, legal trouble, etc.
So the final calculation, the bottom line, is still driven by his own pleasure and pain avoidance. He's managing his own risk by making sure others aren't too unhappy with him.
It's a subtle but crucial point about motivation. And Mill, the guy championing Socrates and higher ideals.
Sidgwick pegs him as an intuitionist hedonist.
Right. Mill is clearly seeking those higher pleasures, knowledge, virtue, which fits Sidgwick's intuitionism category because they're seen as intrinsically valuable beyond mere sensation.
And similar to Bentham in this view, his concern for others' happiness is seen as serving his own goal of achieving that higher, harmonious personal development. It makes him feel more fulfilled, more like Socrates.
So again, the focus ultimately circles back to the self, just a more refined, higher self than Bentham's.
Which means it's only Sidgwick himself who gets tagged as the true universal hedonist.
According to this classification, yes. Sidgwick's version is seen as the one that genuinely integrates the psychological drive for happiness with the intuitive value of higher goods, and then directs it all towards the happiness of the individual and the community as the primary goal, truly embodying greatest happiness of the greatest number as the end, not just a means.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping our heads around this, what's the big takeaway for you listening?
Well, fundamentally, for any utilitarian, the moral green light flashes when an action produces happiness or pleasure. That's the core.
But the huge unresolved debate is how we understand that happiness. Is it Bentham's spreadsheet, pure quantity, run the numbers? Or is it Mill's more complex standard, considering the quality of the happiness?
And we can't forget the critics who just reject the whole premise.
Right, like George Edward Moore, who basically said, good is just good. You can't measure it or define it purely by its consequences or how many people it affects. Its value is intrinsic.
Which leads us to a really sharp question for you to ponder. Think about that classic utilitarian dilemma. A choice saves 10 lives, but requires sacrificing one innocent person.
The trolley problem territory.
Exactly. Now, what if that one person you'd sacrifice happens to be our dissatisfied Socrates, a brilliant philosopher, a spiritual leader, someone embodying Mill's higher pleasures?
How does Bentham's purely quantitative calculus, intensity, duration, extent for the 10 versus the 1 stack up against Mill's approach, which says Socrates' type of existence has a fundamentally higher quality, even if he's currently dissatisfied?
Does Mill's view make sacrificing Socrates morally worse than sacrificing, say, the satisfied fool, even if the numbers saved are the same?
Yeah.
How do you weigh quantity against quality in that life or death moment?
Yeah, that's tough. The moment you try to assign a higher value to wisdom than to simple contentment, the math gets incredibly fuzzy.
The legacy of utilitarianism, whether you lean towards Bentham's numbers or Mill's quality distinctions, forces us to grapple with consequences, to actually try and calculate the impact of our choices.
But that final tension remains, doesn't it? If the ultimate goal is something like spiritual perfection or virtue, Mill's higher plane, can something that profound, that human, ever really be broken down and quantified by the kind of 7-point checklist Bentham started with?
Can you put a number on wisdom or integrity? That's the deep water. Something to maybe calculate for yourself as you navigate your own choices today.